While most men panic at the thought of losing wealth in a divorce, Brandon Pierce treated it like a victory party. He believed he had outsmarted everyone by hiding his fortune, confusing his wife, and walking away with a smug smile and a new life already planned. Standing in court, he signed the final papers with confidence, convinced he was untouchable and far cleverer than the quiet woman he was leaving behind. In his mind, Julia was fragile and alone, and her father was just an aging man with no influence or relevance. What Brandon failed to see was that the moment he celebrated marked the beginning of his downfall, not his freedom. Back in his luxury apartment, he raised a glass in triumph, joking about upgrades and success as the city lights sparkled below, fully certain he had won. He replayed the morning in his head, surprised that Julia hadn't begged or broken down, but he brushed it off as weakness. What he didn't realize was that silence isn't surrender, and the man he dismissed so easily was already preparing a lesson that would cost Brandon far more than money, pride, or reputation. It would unravel the life he thought he controlled. For months, Brandon had convinced himself and everyone around him that Julia was a problem. Too emotional, too fragile, not fit to stand on her own. Yet, when he dropped the divorce papers on the kitchen counter beside her unfinished tea, she didn't react the way he expected. She simply looked at the envelope, calm and steady, wrapped in an old gray sweater with her hair tied back, looking ordinary in a way that irritated him deeply. He mocked her later, laughing about how she only asked if he was sure, as if giving him one last chance, something he found weak and laughable. To Brandon, Julia had become predictable and dull, someone he believed had outgrown long ago, while he saw himself as a man meant for faster lanes and brighter lights. Success had shaped his identity, and as a high-ranking executive in a massive global company, he was used to control and reward. He rewrote their history to suit his pride, forgetting how her quiet support once helped him rise. When asked about money, he boasted proudly, explaining how he had spent years shifting funds, hiding assets, and setting traps so she would walk away with almost nothing while he kept his lifestyle intact. Even her father didn't concern him. He dismissed the older man as irrelevant and distant, convinced there was no one left who could challenge him or undo what he believed was a flawless plan. Brandon brushed off Julia's father as a harmless old man who sent a birthday card and a small check each year, joking that the man lived a simple life and had no clue who he was dealing with, then confidently prepared for the biggest gala of the year, where he planned to show off Tiffany as his new partner. Convinced everyone would admire his boldness, he checked his reflection, straightened his tie, and felt unstoppable, unaware that events were already moving against him. Across town, Julia sat quietly at her kitchen table, reading the divorce papers filled with cold, threatening language, yet she felt calm instead of afraid. Years of ignoring warning signs suddenly made sense, and in that moment she realized the man she once loved was gone for good. Without tears or hesitation, she reached for her old phone and called the one person she trusted completely. When her father answered and immediately sensed something was wrong, she softly told him the truth, and the silence that followed was heavy, steady, and full of meaning, because help was already on its way. Julia's voice broke as she told her father that her husband was leaving her for his assistant, bragging that he had hidden his money overseas and treating her like she was foolish and powerless. William calmly reminded her that she had once asked to live a quiet, independent life, and he had honored that wish, but now he could hear the pain and fear she had tried to hide. When she admitted that her husband was mocking her, belittling her father, and planned to parade his new partner at a public event that very night, William's tone changed, slow and firm, like someone who had reached a limit. He asked her a simple question. Did she want to walk away quietly, or did she want to stand her ground and make sure he understood his mistake? Julia looked around the home she had poured years of care into and felt something steady replace her fear, choosing to face the truth instead of shrinking from it. William told her to get ready, promising he would come not as a quiet old man, but as a father who would no longer stay silent. And by the time the gala began, the balance of power was already shifting. Gregory Vance, the powerful head of Omni Corp, suddenly appeared near the entrance, but instead of his usual confident presence, he looked tense and distracted, constantly checking his watch and wiping his brow as if something important was about to happen. Brandon noticed immediately and found it strange, since Gregory never waited for anyone and usually made others wait for him. As Brandon tried to casually approach with Tiffany, hoping to impress the CEO and secure his next promotion. Gregory brushed him off sharply and revealed that the company's chairman was arriving, someone who had never shown up to an event like this before. He explained in a hushed, urgent tone that the chairman was not a company, but a single, extremely influential individual who had quietly taken control of the company just days earlier, without warning. Brandon stepped back, shaken but trying to hide it, telling himself his performance numbers would protect him no matter who was in charge. Just then, the entire room fell silent as the grand doors opened, and instead of a powerful executive, Julia walked in, transformed and confident, wearing an elegant black gown and carrying herself with calm strength that Brandon had never seen before. The diamonds around her neck caught every light in the room, and as she moved forward with steady grace, it became clear that this night was no longer about Brandon's rise, but about the moment his world began to turn against him. Brandon felt his chest tighten as panic crept in, his voice sharp as he demanded to know why Julia was there and insisted she didn't belong at such a private event, even signaling for security as he rushed forward to stop her. Julia calmly turned to face him, her expression cool and uninterested, as if he were barely worth her attention. Brandon then pointed nervously at the older man walking beside her, a large, commanding figure with a strong presence, dressed simply yet confidently, moving with steady purpose. Before Brandon could process it, Gregory Vance hurried over with visible respect, welcoming the man by name, which made Brandon's thoughts spin out of control. When the man introduced himself as William Sanders, Julia's father, Brandon tried to laugh it off, recalling him as a simple worker, but the man corrected it with a calm smile, explaining that he didn't just fix machines anymore, he fixed bigger problems. As the truth settled in, Brandon realized this man now owned the very company he worked for, having quietly taken control for one clear reason: to protect his daughter. When William placed a firm hand on Julia's shoulder and spoke about handling problems himself, the entire room fell into a heavy, stunned silence, and Brandon stood frozen, finally understanding that the power he mocked had been standing in front of him all along. To Brandon's confidence drained fast as he searched the room for help, locking eyes with the CO, only to see him staring at the floor, pretending none of this was happening. William took his time before speaking, calmly loosening his jacket like he was completely at ease. His voice steady and strong as he explained that he had been studying OmniCorp's records for a long time. He praised the sales numbers, but pointed out the careless spending, the strange costs, and the money quietly moved through offshore routes, calling it messy and careless. Brandon tried to deny it, claiming he was only in sales, but William cut him off, explaining that Brandon was deeply involved when he helped divert money to support a lifestyle he couldn't afford and try to hide it during a divorce. The room filled with whispers as Tiffany slowly pulled away from him, her trust fading. Brandon shouted that it was all false and threatened legal action, tried to regain control, but Julia stepped forward calmly and pulled out a small, wrinkled receipt, explaining she'd found it while doing his laundry after years of noticing things that never added up. She revealed it came from a foreign bank and had been overlooked, not destroyed. William barely glanced at it, smiling instead as he explained that his experts had already uncovered everything that morning, tracing Brandon's actions directly through company systems. In that moment, Brandon realized the secret life wasn't hidden at all, and the silence in the room grew heavier as the truth closed in around him. Because the company systems belonged to him, William calmly explained that every record and file was now under his control. He turned to the shaken CEO and asked whether Brandon's company card was still active, then immediately ordered it shut down and his pay frozen, announcing that Brandon's job was overdue to serious professional violations and misuse of company trust. Brandon shouted that he had a contract and protections, but William cut him off with icy calm, saying those arguments would no longer help him. With a simple gesture, two officials stepped forward, carrying official documents and digital records, and William introduced one of them as a representative from the authorities who was reviewing suspicious overseas money movements. It became clear that the company was fully cooperating and that all emails, including deleted ones, had been recovered through backups Brandon never considered. The room seemed to spin as Brandon realized there was no escape, and he desperately turned to Tiffany for support, begging her to defend him. She recoiled, clearly choosing self-preservation, loudly distancing herself and claiming she knew nothing beyond her assistant role before walking away and leaving him exposed. Julia then stepped closer, calm and composed, her presence stronger than ever, reminding him that this outcome was a result of his own choices and his desire to leave her with nothing. Brandon pleaded, sweating and panicked, trying to blame misunderstandings and claiming he did everything for their future, but Julia dismissed him with quiet firmness, pointing out that he was still lying and that he had already made his decision when he signed the papers. Brandon suddenly broke down, reminding Julia that he had been celebrating earlier that day and begging her to destroy the papers so they could start fresh, promising anything just to fix it. Julia calmly told him it was too late, explaining that she had already signed and filed the documents before arriving, making the divorce final and unchangeable. She added that because Brandon had officially declared he owned very little, while her father's legal team had now proven he held millions taken improperly through the company, he had put himself in serious legal trouble for lying and financial wrongdoing. Leaning in, she quietly explained that since the money came from a business her father now owned, a lawsuit was already in motion, meaning Brandon would not only lose everything, but would spend years paying it back. Stepping away, Julia looked at him with quiet disappointment rather than anger, making it clear he had badly misjudged the situation from the start. With a firm order, her father instructed security to remove Brandon, and as he was escorted out shouting for help, William made it clear there would be no sympathy or forgiveness. Once the doors closed, William smoothly addressed the guests, apologized for the disruption, and invited everyone to continue enjoying the evening, instantly shifting the mood back to celebration. Guests quickly resumed talking, eager to align themselves with a new power in the room and keep their distance from Brandon's downfall, while Julia stood beside her father, took a calm sip of her drink, and finally felt a deep sense of closure. He couldn't return to the penthouse because his key card no longer worked, and the same concierge who had been respectful the night before now calmly told him his access was revoked since the apartment was leased by the company and under review. Every attempt to book a luxury hotel failed, as all his credit cards were declined, even the one he always kept for emergencies. Sitting on a worn-out motel bed, Brandon stared at his phone, seeing dozens of missed calls, none from Tiffany, mostly from reporters and a few from his lawyer, Arthur. When Arthur finally answered, his voice was tense and shaken, warning Brandon that reporters were everywhere and the situation was spiraling fast. Brandon demanded that Arthur fix it, unfreeze the accounts and pressure banks, but Arthur quietly admitted it was impossible. He explained that international authorities had frozen everything, and that William Sanders' legal team was using serious financial laws usually reserved for organized crime cases. They were accusing Brandon of running illegal operations through the company's logistics system, supported by shipping records and emails tied directly to him. Brandon felt sick as he realized they had uncovered deals he believed were hidden forever. Arthur revealed the final blow. Julia had handed over a private storage drive to investigators that morning, claiming she thought it held family memories, but actually contained detailed financial records. According to Arthur, she played her role calmly and convincingly, leaving Brandon exposed, isolated, and facing consequences he could no longer escape. She claimed she handed everything over to ease her conscience, and that was the moment Brandon finally lost control. He hurled his phone across the room, watching it smack the wall and crack, then paced the cramped motel space in disbelief, repeating to himself that this couldn't be real. He had always seen himself as a survivor, someone who never truly lost, and he was desperate to regain control. Grabbing his laptop from the bag he'd saved the night before, he searched frantically for anything that could hurt William Sanders, but every article painted the same picture. A respected businessman known for saving struggling companies, protecting jobs, and donating millions to good causes. There were no scandals, no secrets, nothing he could use. Just then, a knock came at the door and Brandon's stomach dropped. Peeking through the peephole, he saw a legal courier holding a thick stack of documents, and moments later those papers were pressed into his hands, listing lawsuits from the company, legal action from Julia, and a summons to appear before investigators. As the weight of it all sank in, his damaged phone rang again, and a calm voice from the company's HR department informed him that his company car had been located and was already being retrieved. Standing alone in that cheap room, Brandon realized that every last privilege he once took for granted was slipping away, one piece at a time. He was told to take his personal items immediately or they would be discarded, because the vehicle now had to be seized as company property under investigation rules. And the call ended without sympathy. Brandon stared out the motel window just in time to see a large tow truck roll into the lot, its black paint marked with neat gold letters reading Sanders Recovery Services, which made his chest tighten with bitter understanding. Panicking, he rushed outside and grabbed whatever he could from the car, old workout clothes, spare shoes, and a small box of mints, while the driver calmly attached the vehicle and lifted it away without a word. As the car that once defined his success disappeared down the road, Brandon stood frozen in the parking lot of a rundown motel, clutching a bag of dirty laundry and nothing else. A black limousine then pulled up, and for a moment hope returned when he saw his lawyer Arthur Banks inside. Brandon rushed over, begging for help and a ride, but Arthur didn't unlock the door and instead spoke to the window, explaining that he could no longer represent him because the legal fees were tied to frozen funds, and continuing would risk his entire firm. Brandon shouted in anger, accusing Arthur of helping set everything up, but Arthur coolly replied that any such claims would only hurt Brandon further, reminding him that in his current situation, no one powerful was willing to stand beside him anymore. Arthur slowly raised a window, wished Brandon luck in a flat tone, and suggested he look for a public defender, mentioning they were usually overwhelmed, before the limousine drove off and left Brandon standing alone in the fumes. That was when reality truly settled in. No allies, no safety net, and no one coming to help. While Brandon's world was falling apart piece by piece, Julia was quietly taking her life back. Back at the suburban house Brandon had so proudly allowed her to keep, the atmosphere had completely changed. William sat comfortably in Brandon's old leather chair, watching a baseball game with a drink in hand, making the room feel warm and lived in again. When he casually asked if the car had been taken, Julia smiled and confirmed it, then continued opening boxes filled with things she wanted just to avoid criticism: her art supplies, music records, and personal treasures. William made it clear he never liked the car anyway, calling it unnecessary and showy. Julia paused and asked if everything happened was going too far, but William turned serious and reminded her that Brandon didn't just take money, he took years of her confidence and peace, and that kind of damage matters. He assured her that the consequences Brandon now faced were earned and unavoidable, explaining that while Brandon would be starting over with nothing and no future in his old world, Julia was beginning again with support, freedom, and a father firmly by her side. Julia stared at the keys in her hand, noticing the simple keychain marked with a clean, elegant H. William calmly explained that he had bought a historic brownstone uptown in her name that very morning, a place full of character that needed care, vision, and creativity, things he knew she had. When Julia hesitated, overwhelmed and emotional, William reminded her who she was and where she came from, telling her that Sanders build, repair, and restore not just buildings but lives too. He then urged her to get ready for an important board meeting that afternoon, revealing that he had removed the former sales head and needed someone he trusted to guide the company forward. Julia was stunned and tried to doubt herself, but William pointed out that surviving years in a difficult marriage had taught her more about leadership, judgment, and resilience than any business course ever could. As she held the keys tighter, something shifted inside her. She no longer felt small or broken, but steady and capable, ready to step into a future she never thought she'd be allowed to have. Roger had hinted many times that sensitive company contacts were worth a fortune, especially details tied to high-level government work, and Brandon believed his sharp memory was finally his way out. Sitting alone and exhausted, he convinced himself that recalling every name and number could buy his escape. So he called Roger and whispered his offer. Certain money would change everything. Instead, Roger shut him down fast, explaining that Sanders had not only taken control of the company, but turned the scandal into a win, gaining industry trust and power overnight. Anyone connected to Brandon was now completely cut off, warned away by leaders who didn't want trouble. When the call ended, Brandon felt the room close and as reality hit. There was no deal, no escape, and no allies left. Still clinging to false hope, he shifted his focus to Julia, telling himself she was the last door left open, believing he could still sway her emotions if he found her alone. Convinced old routines hadn't changed, he latched onto a familiar place she once visited weekly, unaware that the person he thought he could control no longer existed, He pulled on a cap and dark glasses, no longer looking like a confident executive, but like someone hiding from his own downfall, and even taking the bus felt like another reminder of how far he had fallen. He waited across from the bakery in the uptown area, and right on time a black car arrived, but Julia stepped out with 2 security guards and an air of authority he didn't recognize. She wasn't the cautious, frugal woman he remembered. She wore a sharp cream-colored outfit, spoke firmly on her phone, and moved with calm confidence. Brandon followed her inside while the guard stayed out, hoping for a quick word, but when he spoke her name, she didn't rush or panic. She finished her order and faced him with cool control. She warned him that he wasn't supposed to be near her, and when he tried to grab her arm, she broke free instantly and told him not to touch her, making it clear she was no longer afraid. He tried to insult her success and claimed she was pretending, but Julia stepped closer and shut him down, explaining that she learned by listening while he wasted years cutting corners. She told him the company was stronger without him. Sales were up, and his shortcuts were gone, and as he raised his voice in desperation, everyone around him could see who truly held the power now. When Brandon tried to threaten her with personal information, Julia calmly turned around and told him she had already spoken publicly about her struggles, explaining that facing him openly was the reason they no longer controlled her life. She made it clear that his real problem was living in fear of his own secrets, while she had moved on. As the guards approached, Brandon's anger collapsed into desperate pleading, admitting he was broke and asking for a small amount of money out of pity. But Julia felt nothing as she studied his worn clothes and defeated posture. She refused firmly, telling him that his biggest issue was still believing he deserved help he never earned, and that hardship might be the only lesson left for him to learn. The guards escorted him away without resistance, and Julia calmly ordered her coffee and asked the police to be notified. Soon after, Brandon's trial became a public spectacle, drawing reporters, former co-workers, and curious onlookers eager to watch his downfall. Sitting beside an exhausted public defender, Brandon still believed he could talk his way out, but the case against him was overwhelming, with detailed financial records, expense proofs, and testimony from people who once worked for him. Even Tiffany testified, describing how he mocked his wife and treated serious matters lightly, and by the end it was clear that charm could not erase years of deception. Brandon once bragged that his wife was a safety net, someone he believed would never leave because he thought she lacked confidence, and those words stayed with the jury as they watched him with clear disgust. When the final witness was called, William Sanders took the stand calmly, speaking without anger but with the steady confidence of a man who had built successful businesses from the ground up. He explained that he never approved the illegal transfers, and that while the company recovered financially, the real damage was the way Brandon's actions destroyed trust and encouraged dishonesty among hard-working employees. William made it clear that stealing money is wrong, but damaging trust harms far more people, and Brandon could not even meet his eyes as the weight of those words settled in the room. The jury needed less than 2 hours to reach a unanimous guilty verdict on every charge, and days later, Brandon stood before a judge known for strict rulings in financial crime cases. The judge stated plainly that she saw no regret, only excuses and blame directed at everyone else, including his own family, and said he treated people like tools rather than human beings. She sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, ordered full repayment of the stolen money, and ruled that his future income would be taken until the debt was cleared. As officers led him away, Brandon searched the room for Julia, hoping for a reaction, but she was gone, while William quietly acknowledged the court and walked out, leaving Brandon to face the consequences of his choices alone. The thick door of the holding area slammed shut, ending Brandon shouting and leaving him alone with the noise in his head. And 6 months later, he learned that life in a federal prison camp was nothing like the easy rumors he once believed. The place was dull, freezing, and nonstop noisy, and his days were spent folding endless piles of laundry for a few cents an hour, a sharp fall from the life he once lived. On visiting day, he expected no one, as his family had cut him off after the trial, and Tiffany had vanished into a new life far away. So when a guard called his name, his heart raced with false hope. He imagined Julia had come back, maybe with forgiveness or regret, but instead he found Arthur Banks sitting across the glass, looking worn down, thinner, and defeated in a cheap suit. Arthur admitted he wasn't there to help but to warn him, explaining that investigators had followed the money trail and charged him too, and he had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. When Brandon asked about Julia, hoping to hear she was struggling, Arthur calmly told him she was thriving, leading the company with integrity, earning public praise, and preparing to start a charity to help others avoid financial manipulation. The final blow came when Arthur revealed she was engaged to someone who treated her with respect, and before leaving, he passed along her message, saying she hoped Brandon would finally learn who he was, because now he had no one else to blame, and with that, Arthur put the phone down and walked away, leaving Brandon staring at his own reflection in the glass. Brandon stayed frozen, the phone still in his hand as the dead tone hummed back at him, and when he glanced at the glass, he barely recognized the tired face staring back, pale skin, empty eyes, and a plain uniform that erased everything he once flaunted. His whole life had been spent chasing importance, afraid of being invisible, and in trying to have it all, he had ended up with nothing that truly mattered. He returned to his narrow bunk as the metal door shut with a heavy sound, sat down, and stared at the bare wall, realizing how deeply wrong his values had been. For years, he judged himself by money, status, and the jealousy of others, treating trust like a weakness and relationships like business deals. Now, without power, titles, or freedom, the lesson finally settled in. Real strength never came from control or riches, but from self-respect and protecting the people you love. He had believed he was outsmarting everyone, only to learn too late that he had underestimated those who played the long game with integrity and patience. Alone in the quiet, Brandon understood that this was the end point of his own choices, left only with memories of chances he wasted and a life he had dismantled himself. And as the story closes, viewers are left to decide whether his fall felt fair or severe, and are invited to share their thoughts, support the channel, and stay tuned for more powerful stories of consequence and justice.